After pulling your data into Parabola, the next step is to make it usable. Think about when you open an Excel file, before you get to a lot of that analysis, you usually have to do some amount of data cleanup so that the data is usable and in the format that you want it in. Now, this isn't about making your data perfect, but it's about making sure the data is clean enough so that it's easy to combine your data, troubleshoot errors, and ultimately revisit this flow and understand what's happening step by step. The goal of this lesson is to teach you the different methods for data cleanup and show you how you can actually build those in Parabola so that flow building feels faster and more intuitive. At a high level, there are three different ways that we can clean our data set at the beginning of our flow. We can clean columns, rows, or specific values within our flow. To talk about each of those more specifically and share some examples, when we talk about cleaning up columns, oftentimes we're talking about renaming columns so that they're more specific and easier to follow throughout our flow. For instance, instead of ID, maybe we rename to invoice ID. Similarly, it's really helpful to remove unnecessary columns at the beginning of your flow because the less data you're working with, the easier it is for you, the human, to follow your data throughout the flow, but it's also easier for Parabola's agent to kind of eliminate the fluff and just focus on those important columns. Remember, this is going to be one of the biggest unlocks to making your flows easier to build, read, and troubleshoot, narrowing down the columns you're working with and giving them nice and clear names. We also have the ability to clean rows of data, which often looks like filtering out records we don't need, such as removing records that are, older than 30 days, or maybe removing or merging duplicate rows together. Oftentimes, if we have a whole bunch of repeating emails or IDs, you might want to just keep the first record in your data set that has that unique value. You also might want to do something like splitting rows apart, where if you have a comma-separated list, maybe you want to split each of those values into its own row or its own column. Now, when it comes to cleaning values, this is where we start thinking about things like formatting numbers or dates, removing different prefixes. So for instance, if you're looking at a SKU or a reference number, maybe you want to get rid of or add part of that back. And then we also can do things like find and replaces, removing spaces, and ultimately making sure all of our cells are nice and clean for the downstream combinations and transformations that we'll do next. Now, whether you're cleaning data or combining and transforming data, there are three prompting tips I'd recommend you keep in mind to get the best possible results. The first is to be as specific as possible, which really comes into play when we're referencing column names. Referencing column names exactly and putting those column names in quotes often helps get the best possible results. Second, I'd encourage you to provide examples where you can. If you're trying to reformat a value to maybe a currency format, it's often helpful to provide an example of exactly what you're trying to achieve. Finally, I'd encourage you to remind Parabola about your ultimate goal when you're providing prompts. When Parabola knows what you're ultimately trying to accomplish, it can come up with recommendations and maybe different ways of achieving the same thing more efficiently to ultimately get you to that same place in the end. Now that we understand the three different types of data cleanup, let's jump into the product to put some of these prompting tips to action. Before we write a prompt to clean our data, let's revisit the data sets that we uploaded in the pull data lesson. First, we have our shipping invoice line items, where I can see for a specific invoice which shipping method was used, what were the weights, the pricing zone, and the actual rate charged. And then in our rate card, which is like our contracted rates, we're going to be able to see what you actually should be paying for each shipping method based on the pricing zone and the weight. Now, what I'll do here is go ahead and write a prompt to start cleaning our data. In this example, I'm going to say, I need to clean my invoice and rate card datasets before joining them. Help me standardize column names across both datasets so the data is easy to follow downstream. Additionally, remove the order number field from my invoice data. Finally, help me clean weight data. My invoice data is in ounces and my rate data is in pounds. Now, is this maybe more detail than we need to provide? Potentially yes, because Parabola is quite good at looking at your data sets and figuring out what we have to do. But your takeaway here can be the more specific you are, the more Parabola is going to do exactly what you instruct. But the more ambiguous instructions, things like, hey, help me standardize column names across both data sets, you're kind of leaving it to Parabola to look at the data and figure out what to do, and oftentimes it's going to give you a really great result with that approach as well. Now I'm going to send this off And in a couple seconds, we'll see how Parabola starts to clean these datasets. A few seconds later, we can see Parabola added steps directly to the canvas to clean our invoice columns. If I read our bullets, we can see exactly what Parabola did here, doing things like standardizing our column names, removing columns, and then also converting invoice weights into our bill weight for ounces. Now, Parabola is going to also ask clarifying questions along the way, as we can see here. It's saying, hey, do you want your downstream join to use the bill weight in ounces as the weight key? In this example, we do. So I will tell Parabola that feedback, and it'll go ahead and implement that update into the steps that it just applied. Now that Parabola has implemented that update, we can see that we're all set and ready to join on bill weight and ounces, and it's also giving us an overview of the fields that we'll use to join or combine our data in the next lesson. Now, whenever Parabola is making updates, it's always good to look at the data and make sure you really understand how the data is being transformed step by step. As I click into a step here, we'll see the data grid where all of these green columns indicate column names that are changed or new columns of data. Now, let's say as I'm looking at the data, I decide for one reason or another that I'd actually like the invoice rate and actually all currency symbols to not have that dollar sign. I can either click a column, cell, or row to put it in focus, and then we can go ahead and tell Parabola exactly what we'd like to change. So let's actually have all of our currency values formatted without a dollar sign, and I'm also providing some example values here. After those updates, we can see if we click into our data that our invoice rate is now correctly formatted, and you can also see in the little summary logic here that we're normalizing our currency field to remove the dollar sign and standardize to do decimals. In many cases in practice, you probably will find that you're not prompting at this level of specificity where you're just focused on cleaning our data. A lot of times if your initial prompt has your end goal and some context on your use case, Parabola will put all of those steps on the canvas and intuitively create some of the rules that we've seen here to clean your data. But it's still helpful to understand how we can prompt Parabola to make our data cleaner at the beginning of our flow, which is ultimately going to make it easier to follow and understand as we continue to build. Now that you understand the core concepts of cleaning data in Parabola, we'll focus on combining that data that we just cleaned in the next lesson. Before you jump, make sure to check out the building challenge at the bottom of this page and clean the data that you uploaded in the previous lesson.